really moved on to these plants, and so did the other insects. Now, of course, you must remember that the early plants didn't have the complicated nectaries. You know, the nectar is found in very specific locations in our modern day plants. But if you look at the ancient plants, even avocado, you'll notice that it's formed on a sort of a disc. It's just a slight depression and there's nectar around. And why do you think that was? Remember what I told you about the butterflies at the time? Their mouth parts were for eating pollen. So they hadn't really the apparatus for sucking it up. So the plants also had, they didn't have these complicated structures. But as time went on, the plants evolved and so did the butterflies. So as the plants evolved, the butterflies started changing the structure of their mouth parts to a kind of a tube, and it became longer and longer. And this is what we see today. Gets into that. Of course, this is over many millions of years, or many thousands of years anyway. So the plants went on to produce some extraordinary flowers. And this particular one that we have today is having a long corolla tube. And the butterfly here has undergone genetic changes over millions of years to be able to collect the nectar from this, using its long proboscis. This is one of the butterflies in Sri Lanka that has a very long proboscis. And in this picture you can see that the pollen is now very effectively carried. Now the thing about angiosperms is that unlike the earlier plants, it produces very little pollen. Remember the wind pollinated one where there were the copious amounts of pollen? Now these guys produce very little pollen, but it is extremely effective in getting that pollen onto the female plant. And they basically harness the power of flight of all the organisms that were there, and the butterflies were no exception. So the butterflies also evolved, co-evolved as they say, to feed on these plants, right? And of course, some underwent modifications to have small flowers. So some butterflies have very small proboscis, some have long ones. However, evolution doesn't always favor just because you produce nectar, it doesn't mean that the butterflies are all going to go after the nectar of the plants. Some of the butterflies evolve to feed on the flowers themselves. Of course, this doesn't do a lot of good to the plants, but certainly it does a lot of good to the butterflies, because this is an extraordinarily nutritious part of the plant, very high in protein. So they evolve to feed on flowers, fruits, even things like wood apple here. There's a butterfly in Sri Lanka that lays eggs on it, and it's really, really interesting to see a larva, which is a caterpillar that is 0.5 millimeter long, going through this thick shell. It's very interesting to watch, because it's unbelievable that such a small creature can go right into it, even a mature wood apple. Anyway, these are very high the seeds are very high in protein, they're very nutritious, and these butterflies are able to complete their life cycles very, very quickly because of the very high proteinaceous contents of these parts. And there's another butterfly that went even further in the evolution, evolving further to feed on the insects that feed on these plants. So here's the ape fly larva. This is an ape fly larva feeding on mealybugs, which you find on angiosperm plants. So this is the only one of its type in Sri Lanka. So as a result of the angiosperms coming onto the scene, there were all sorts of things that were going on, and the butterflies have radiated out and formed many, many different types of species. So far so good? Everybody with me? Okay. In the meantime, now while this is going on, what's happening in the other continents? So I like to focus on Sri Lanka, India, and Madagascar, and Africa. So here we are. So this is going on, and here's Madagascar here. I'm taking to an earlier time here. 170 million years ago, everything is together. The land starts breaking up over here. Madagascar is still attached to the Indian continent, and India is attached to the Antarctica and Australia. Okay? That's about 160 million. Incidentally, these dates are, it's always contestable as to whether this date is right or not. Scientists always argue about these things. But in this presentation, all that I want you to get out of this is the story behind what happened rather than the dates. Okay? So around 135 million years ago, Madagascar and India breaks away, right? And they start drifting, as you can see over here. All right, they're still together, Madagascar and India. And over here, at 88 million years, Madagascar breaks away from India. Now, if I may take you back to one of the previous slides, isolation, what does isolation do? Are you sleeping? Isolation and time will cause mutations, and then you get different species, right? And they will be different from the ones over there because they can't meet each other and have sex, right? They're two different populations. So you would expect India and Madagascar to be very, very similar in both their flora as well as their fauna, right? Because they're coming together. They must be all similar organisms there. Now, just a few other points that I like to make. Now, this breaking away of continents is a very rapid process. It moves 2 to 4 centimeters a year. So it takes a long time to go long distances. Is that right, Rohan? 2 centimeters? Yeah, if I may right. Okay? So I put some information here. So isolation for a long period should have very unique species in India as well as in Madagascar. All right? Both of those. The problem is that India does not have, incidentally, India and Sri Lanka was connected with each other for so long that when I talk of India, you can assume that I'm talking about Sri Lanka as well. Okay? Intermittently, it was disconnected. So India and Sri Lanka was connected for much of its geologic history. But the problem in India is that it does not have unique species. In fact, it is quite poor in endemism. I'm sure the people who studied snakes and fish might contest that. It is true that they do have a large number of endemics in those faunal groups, but not in butterflies. In fact, it is very poor. You will see that in the next slide. Compare that with Madagascar. I'm going to just draw your attention to this number here. Madagascar has about 300 species and 200 are endemics. That's an awfully large number, about 66%, as opposed to Madagascar, as opposed to India, which has only about 100 endemics out of 1,300 species. It's a very, very poor turnout. And so is Sri Lanka. We have a very poor number of endemics, less than 10%, or about 10%. We're not quite certain of the number, but about that much. And Australia has a very high degree of endemism. Again, isolation for a long period of time, mutations occur, and you have all sorts of different species that are endemic to that particular landmass. Right? Now the question is, what's going on here? I've given you some more information here, some details if you are interested in. India, for instance, has only 3 species that are endemic, in the sense that that actually evolved in India. Remember, years and years of isolation, it moves upward. So that is the relic fauna. The ancient butterflies, of the ancient butterflies, there are only 3 species left in India out of the 1,300. So one might begin to ask, what really happened? What's going on here? Right? So that's the Travancore evening brown. If anybody is interested in butterflies in a little more detail, it's a butterfly called the Travancore evening brown. And there's another genus that is endemic to a group of butterflies that are endemic to India. 2 of them, and I put it over there. Sri Lanka, as I said, we are very poor. Incidentally, Costa Rica, which is about the same size as Sri Lanka, has 1,200 species of butterflies. Sri Lanka has 247. We sometimes contest whether it's 246 or 247, because even 1 is a great thing for us. And here it is, a place like that. So we don't have a great diversity of butterflies. Of course, there is a thing called the island effect, but notwithstanding that, we are still poor in our butterfly fauna. The question is, what happened? If all the Indian butterflies are not endemic, what happened? Well, that's what happened. Oops. Oh. Well, I'll read it for you. I'll tell you what it is. It's a volcanic activity in India that took place about 65 to 70 million years ago. And this volcanic activity didn't occur once, twice. It actually occurred for thousands of years. Thousands of years, there was very, very violent volcanic activity in this region, which we call the Deccan Plate. I'll tell you what happened here. So what happened was, as you know, volcanoes are things that produce very toxic gases and fumes and all kinds of other stuff. And it is believed that much of the fauna was destroyed by these volcanic eruptions that occurred over many thousands of years. Of course, that included the butterflies as well. And we believe that one of the reasons why the endemic genera are so poor in India is because all the original stuff got wiped out because of this volcanic activity. And it was so great that this is what it looks like today after 65 million years. This is actually the volcanic, the basalt that came up and formed layers and layers and layers of rock. It is much weathered now. Rain and high temperatures and action of plants and animals and so on and so forth have degraded it. But this is what the Deccan Plateau looks like now. It's a vast area. In case you didn't notice, it's this area here. That's the Deccan Plate. That's the area that has this volcanic stuff. Oops. And that's what it looks like, another picture of it. So it's a very vast extent. And the highest point is about 3,000 meters, 2,600, about there. So it's very, very high. And the lowest point is about 600 meters. So you can just imagine the scale of the destruction that might have occurred at that time. Okay, so there it is. India is moving in a northeasterly direction. And there it is. Incidentally, these diagrams are not quite right. India didn't look like this present political boundaries that we have shown here. It looked probably very different, but the idea is the same. So here it is. It's moving up, and that's about, if I can read my notes here. I can read. It's about 65 million years ago. So that's about 65 million years ago. And it keeps moving north. Incidentally, India moved relatively fast compared to the other continents. We don't know why, but I'm sure there's some explanation for that. And as it gets closer and closer and closer, what do you expect? Now, Indian subcontinent is depopulated. The volcanic activity has destroyed much of the stuff that was there. Now it's getting closer and closer to the Eurasian plate. I shouldn't use the word plate, but we did talk about plates. Remember tectonic plates? So it's going to strike the other continent, which is further up north, right? But before it gets there, obviously, any animal that has the ability to fly, whether it's birds, the dinosaurs, or whatever it was, could come across. And of course, it will start populating the Indian continent, right? The Indian plate. So butterflies probably came from there even before it struck the Eurasian plate. But for them to survive, they must have the right type of plants. Because I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but butterflies are extremely picky as to what plants they would lay their eggs on. In fact, there are some butterflies in Sri Lanka that would lay only on one type of plant. For instance, the banded peacock will lay its eggs only on Buruta, Suetania, Chloroxina suetania. So unless they found the plants in that continent, they would never survive. But remember, the angiosperms are there, and they have devised various mechanisms to disperse their seeds. The fruit-eating birds could have come across, and of course with their droppings they would have dropped the seeds. Various animals could have swum across, and so on and so forth. So India started getting not only the butterflies and the birds and the mammals, but they were also getting all the different types of plants, even before the land struck, because they were capable of flight, or they had some mechanisms to get there. So at some point in time, the upper part of India strikes the northeast corner, which we call the Assam-Burma Gateway. That's the common term that they use. So that is believed the first point of attachment. And of course, then the connection is complete and everything starts flowing in. What do you think the major thing that we see today is as a result of the collision? The Himalayas, of course, because the plates, now the plate is moving, and of course the plate can go underneath, subsidence or subduction or what they call it, but they can also push. And of course, at the scale that we are talking about, the soil and everything gets lifted up and up and up, and we have the Himalayas there. And what do you think is happening to the plants and animals? They are evolving. Now they are under intense cold, there is a lot of cold weather now because the elevations are rising, perhaps they have glaciers, ice forming, and the butterflies also now change. There are adaptations that are going on. So the speciation is still occurring. Speciation of these species form all the time. And so you get a different dynamic, different plants coming in, different animals adapting to different environments. Okay, so there is India now, fully attached to the Eurasian continent. Now I'm using a different set of words here. I'm not saying it's, I'm not saying North America, South America. Those are political boundaries, right? We talk about China and so on and so forth. But scientists would like to define these regions based on the groups of animals that are in that particular continent or in that particular landmass. For instance, Africa has a very distinct set of faunal groups. They have gorillas, lemurs, and giraffes, and so on and so forth. So that's one zoogeographic region, right? It's very distinct. The faunal groups, they are very distinct. And so is Australia with its marsupials, you know, the kangaroos, the wallabies, and so on and so forth. And so is it with Americans, South America, North America. So these are called zoogeographic regions. The reason why I introduced this word was because I'm going to use it in the subsequent slides. So we have the Palearctic, Oriental, African. There are more, as scientists go, there are lots of other regions that they sub-classify. There are smaller zoogeographic regions as well. But these are the main ones. So where do you think our butterflies came from? Well, obviously they are not from India, and they are not from Sri Lanka either. They obviously have come from elsewhere. So how do we go about, as scientists, how do we go about saying that this group came from there and this group came from there? Remember what I talked about, isolation and speciation? The principle is this. If a butterfly originated here, it is very likely that the highest number of species would be found in that particular continent because they had time to speciate. So you might have 25 similar looking species in Africa, but there's only one in India. So that means that they actually evolved in Africa, and the one that you find in India is the one that arrived over land or over sea or whatever that is. You got the idea? Though if you have the highest number of species in a particular continent, a geographic region, we will assume that that is the place from which it came. And I'm going to give you some examples of it as well. Now, I have given you some numbers here. I have said that the Palearctic region, which is the Mongolian steppes above Europe and so on and so forth, they contributed only 1%. African continent, the African geographic region contributed 12%. The Oriental, 74%. Actually, I shouldn't say Oriental. It's actually the eastern part of the Oriental. It's more appropriately called the Malayan region, the Malayan zoogeographic region, right? At least for the butterflies, not for others, for butterflies. And then Australia contributed 3%. So if you add it up, there's only 90% of the species or the genera. What happened to the other 10%? Any idea? No, not in the mix. We just don't know. Because you see, I said that if you have a very large number of species here and only one species here, we can say it's Africa, right? But if there's 10% here, 10% here, 10% here, 10%, so we really have no idea from where they came. All right? So, so we say that we are not certain from where they came. Those are the species that disperse very, very widely. So there are some species like that. So here are the ones of African origin. We have, as I said, we have about 12% of our species of African origin. Now, this particular species here, I showed this to you, and I asked you where did it come from. It actually came from Africa, tropical Africa. the very wet tropical forests of Africa. And there you would see 180 species of this particular butterfly. Very, very similar looking, same characteristic features that you would find in all of them, but there are 180 species in Africa. However, there are only 25 outside Africa. So that clearly tells us that the place that these species originated is Africa. And we have one species in Sri Lanka. One of them is in Sri Lanka, slightly differentiated from the species in Africa. Anybody wants to take a guess why this is, we have only one from tropical Africa? Well, look at the continent. If you look at the continent, this is desert, pretty much extremely hostile terrain. This is very nice and moist and so on and so forth. This butterfly is very unlikely to get across this desert, or it's very unlikely to fly across this oceanic gap, which is too wide. So the ability for these butterflies to come would be determined by the terrain and the position in which they are in, and their adaptations as well. So for that reason, this butterfly is an exception to the rule for having come across over the mountains. Some or other made it across, and there are a few species in India as well. Now this one, on the other hand, this is called the Tonycosta acrea. All the species virtually are found in Africa. Over 200 species of this particular butterfly are found in Africa. Very, very similar looking, but distinct, and they belong to the same genus. And only 3 species are found elsewhere. We have one in India, one in Sri Lanka, one in Thailand. I understand that this species is now spreading even to China. Anyway, the idea, you got the idea what's happening. This is a species not of the tropical places, but more the dry areas in Africa. So it has several species in this region as well. So that's one example. So that's an African origin. This one, we classify it as African, but it's really not African. It's sub-Saharan, or Saharan, or maybe even Central Arabian. Again, under very, very dry climates, it evolved over there, both species, this particular genus called Calotis. And again, you can look, 60 species in the African region. That's not African, that's really sub-Saharan, okay? And 18 species elsewhere. Because they could withstand an enormous amount of stress in terms of heat, they were able to spread to the much, much dry areas elsewhere in the world. And guess where you might find this in Sri Lanka? In Mannar, Arippu, the entire northwestern coast, where it is extremely dry. So both species are found in the driest regions of Sri Lanka. So they are not, unfortunately, from here. They are coming from elsewhere, right? But don't lose hope. We'll see what it happens. Okay? Now, as I said, there is lots of other evidence to indicate that they are from there as well. You can do DNA analysis. In fact, the DNA profile would be very, very similar to the ones in Africa or in the sub-Saharan regions. They feed on the same plants, the caterpillars. They have similar habitats. They like very dry regions. They look the same, almost the same. In fact, some are cosmopolitan. They look exactly the same thing as the ones elsewhere. All right, depending on the species.